Well, good morning to all of you, and let me start by saying that I clearly don't have the answers to all the questions you're looking for, but I will share some of my own experiences, and by and large, of course, it's a fairly humbling process trying to address culture, and I'll explain why that is. I also enjoyed David's presentation, and I concur with much of that, so I won't try and replicate a framework. But in my general simple experience, culture at the end of the day is just it's a system of shared beliefs and social behavior that defines how you express those beliefs. So you're dealing with something which is fairly subjective, fairly unformed, and by definition something that has a tendency to evolve, for better or worse. So it's not a static situation. Moreover, I don't believe there is any such thing as a definition of an absolute archetype that says this is a good culture, that is a bad culture, this is an indifferent culture, because culture is highly situational and context specific, and you really can't even begin to have a discussion around culture unless you place it in context. And that's a more important thought than people, I think, sometimes realize, because if you start to impose archetypes of what you believe are fully formed, perfected cultures on organizations, the probability of rejection is very, very high indeed. But let me tell you that I think in threes, not in sixes. I'll give you my sense of the three things which you have to think about when you start to deal with issues around culture and cultural change and so on. And the first I would agree with, which is critical, is culture is usually born out of a sense of alignment around purpose. I think that is true in all situations. That's true in human society in general, because fundamentally it's a social contract, and a social contract relies on people believing that they actually have a shared and common cause of some kind. Otherwise, there is no contract. Why are we coming together? We're coming together because there is a perception that there is something that outside of us that we collectively believe it's worth working towards. And I think if you fail to articulate that in some way, or you fail to align people around some sense of purpose, then clearly culture as such is likely to be very poorly rooted. But the second thing about culture is that it is typically organic. It is not imposed by CEOs, it is not imposed by consultants, it's not imposed by investors, and I've been all of those. It is, by definition, because it is a social contract, it has to be organic. That's not to say that you can't challenge it as a CEO, and you can't hope to shape it as an advisor, or you can't hope to influence it. But you must recognize a central fact and never assume the hubris of believing that culture is something that can be imposed. Culture is organic. It develops fundamentally through the consensual understanding around shared beliefs, and the social behaviors that you see are an outcome of a highly organic process. That has implications for how you think about changing culture. And it, again, essentially means that when you change culture, you have to go with the grain, not against the grain, if you're going to be successful. And therefore, the empathy required to start to understand where the strengths lie in a particular culture before you start to worry about changing it is absolutely critical. Always start with the strengths, always start with an empathetic understanding around what is actually working well. What is it that caused this group to form in the first place around this social contract, and to actually believe that there might have been a sense of purpose and alignment around which they had formed, and pay sufficient respect to that process, because that's where the heart of the consensus would have essentially arisen. So cultural change is fundamentally about learning and understanding how you can start by going with the grain. Every institution will fundamentally have a set of strengths, However obvious its weaknesses may be. And by the way, the more of an outsider and the more of a clinical eye you cast, all our organizations have tremendous weaknesses. They present themselves very obviously. The strengths often do not present themselves as obviously. That's true of us as human beings and within our families as well. We perceive each other's weaknesses much quicker than we do each other's strengths. Natural human reaction. But if you are going to undertake a process of cultural change, really go with the grain and start to understand what that might mean. I think the third thing about culture, even more so today, is that you can't deify it and essentially view it as something which is immutable or unchangeable. You can't worship it. One of the fallacies that often arises in institutions and which holds development back is a notion that culture is like religion, that it is something constant, immutable, and revealed to us through a greater force, and we must bow down to it, and therefore in some sense it becomes viewed as immutable, and it becomes in a way an oppressive force in an organization. And in a world where change is, of course, if anything, even more rapid than it's ever been any time in human history, if culture is not adaptable, it's by definition unlikely to sustain. So alignment, a sense that culture is organic, that it is built through consensual processes over time, and that it must be adaptable, I think are very important. The questions are usually delicate around how do you contest culture? If you are in a position of leadership in an organization and you believe what I've just said, that you need to work with the grain, there appears to be a contradiction in saying that you're now going to have to contest and contradict elements of the culture. And how do you do it? Well, there's no easy answer, frankly. And cultural change involves friction. And we shouldn't be surprised, therefore, if there is friction. And there's no magic wand that you can wave and say you're going to get people from here to there in the complete absence of friction. But it's about the relative weight of being able to work with the grain. Say, these are the strengths that we fundamentally have. For example, you may have strengths around domain knowledge, you may have strengths around loyalty, you may have strengths around a sense of community, you may have a host of weaknesses around performance outcomes, you may have weaknesses around adaptability, you may have weaknesses around meritocracy, and so on. So you're trying to take the strengths that you have and link them to a set of outcomes which will allow you to adapt. Successful cultures are defined, as I said, not in absolute terms, but by their relative ability to address the purpose for which they exist. And that's why I can't offer you a universal definition of what a successful culture is, because in a given context, a successful culture is one that is responding to the context and situation in which it finds itself. For that industry, for that moment in time, what is it that you need? As consultants, and I've been one in my previous life, lots of jargon will get created around the archetypes and how you evolve. They are helpful mental models. CEOs know that, and I'm now a CEO. I know how to use those models. And of course, you use them as mere markers in a journey. You don't get wedded to them. And people will talk today of digital natives, of agile organizations. These are actually terms that are defining a shift in culture. If you are in a world where a third of what you do is about to get automated, replaced by artificial intelligence, substituted by a disruption in business model, there is very little point, frankly, in continuing to deify an existing way of doing business. No matter how much you may believe that you are religiously holding on to a set of cultural beliefs. And some of these may be issues as simple as, because we are human communities, as saying, it's important to hold cohorts together. It's important to respect seniority. Some of these are cultural reflexes. It's important to give everybody an opportunity to continue in the organization, even when it becomes apparent that their relative skills and abilities have got detached from the needs of the organization. It's important that we essentially only promote people from within. It's important that we only bring people from the outside. Whatever may be these cultural beliefs, these are going to have to be challenged, and they must be contested, as I said, and it's a job of a CEO to create a mechanism for contestation which doesn't break down the underlying consensus in an institution. By the way, one of the most difficult choices you have as a CEO is when you fundamentally find that you really have no option but to confront a culture head on. Typically, this will happen in the backdrop of a crisis of some kind. There are such examples that have occurred. The crisis could be an economic one. It could be a breakdown in values. Enron was such an institution where the culture had to be challenged head on, in a sense, because it was clear that the mechanisms and the mutual accommodation within the management of practices that were clearly inimical to the long-term future of the organization had to be broken apart and reformed. It could be in the case of a company like IBM, which fundamentally lost its way completely in the 90s and is in the process of trying to reinvent itself today. So you will have the situation where sometimes the methods I've described of trying to go with the grain, continue to build consensus, break down, and you then do need the courage as leaders to say, this is truly a matter of survival. Ultimately, if cultures don't survive, there's a Darwinian element, and you have to learn not just how to develop cultures, but sometimes you need to put cultures to sleep so that new cultures can be born. It's not a popular view, and it's not the first option that you should undertake, but it is sometimes something that is required. Just one other set of observations on the situational importance of culture. There are many different types of institutions which will define whether or not you have a monolithic culture or a diverse culture. Let me take 3 examples. If you're a professional services organization, a group of lawyers, a group of accountants, a group of management consultants, a group of peers essentially working in partnership, then fundamentally what matters is peer relationships and a linkage through a common set of values. And typically you will evolve a very highly homogeneous culture by design, because the fundamental bonds of professional partnership require that very high level of alignment, trust, and common understanding, and the business model actually requires that to succeed. If you are running a multi-business conglomerate, on the other hand, a successful multi-business conglomerate, it is critical that rather like the Republic of India, you develop a highly federal structure where you will consciously seek to evolve subcultures and environments where people can operate in a non-homogeneous way, in a non-monolithic way, because attempts to apply a monolithic approach will be highly counterproductive. So there is no sanctity to the notion that cultures are necessarily good because they are uniformly implemented across all parts of a business, regardless of the structure of the business and regardless of the different business challenges that may be faced by components of a business. That is a fatal error that I have seen some CEOs filled with hubris of their authority trying to implement, where they start to develop notions around my way. There's a sort of cultish tendency some CEOs develop where they believe they have discovered a revealed truth which should now be the way groups do business. I can make the examples in my mind, including some here, but I will not say them out because I don't want to get sued for defamation. That cultish tendency is clearly something which has to be, I think any free-thinking person whose reasoning abilities are still alive will question those when it actually comes to how you think about culture in that context. And then, of course, you have institutions which may, for historical reasons, have come together with diverse cultures. Could be because of mergers and acquisitions, could be because of changes in their mandate. And again, you have a very different situation when you have inorganically combined cultures from different places being brought together. And as a CEO, it becomes your responsibility to manage and lead that. That's not the same process as immediately saying, I have now got a my way, and the first thing I'm going to do is to introduce it. Nor is it a case of simply saying the easiest answer for me is to allow contradictory cultures to exist. So the level of judgment required here is immense. And yet, simply because there is a subjective element to this doesn't reduce its importance. It is the most important task a CEO has, to actually make those judgments, and frankly, to be held accountable for those judgments, because those calls are the ones which will eventually determine the relative sustainability of an institution. And the ultimate job you have as a CEO is to ensure your institution survives. Everything else follows from that. But in today's world, and it is not an exaggeration, there are very few CEOs who I think when they go to bed at night can confidently say they are creating or leaving behind institutions which they are very confident are actually going to survive. So the role of culture in providing the social consensus, the adaptability, the willingness to actually continuously evolve is fundamentally the responsibility a CEO has. And I think a humble understanding around what culture actually is, how you need to treat it with respect and yet with clarity, be courageous when you need to actually be confrontational, but at all times have tried to work with the grain before you get to that point. And frankly, it's always a journey in progress. I don't think anybody can claim final success when it comes to defining culture. I've worked in professional services institutions which have had a breakdown in ethics despite years of apparent success. So culture gets challenged. Culture in strange ways will get tripped up. But you keep moving forward, and it's, your job is critical as a CEO to be highly vigilant and to take people along with you on that journey. So I'm not here to give you any sort of mantras in that sense, but really this is the sum total of the experience that I can share in 10 or 15 minutes. And of course, I'm very happy to take some questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that insightful session. We'd now like you to answer, we'd like to ask the best question that was sent to us earlier for you to answer, and then we'll call upon the winner for you to give him away the prize. Good and bad things about rewards and incentives is that they drive behaviors. For example, I once learned from an Ola driver how they found ways to manipulate Ola's incentive schemes. How do you ensure that rewards and incentives don't drive undesirable behaviors? Is there a foolproof technique?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it is well understood by many of you are HR managers that the natural tendency of any reward system that is established is that it will be gamed. I think you have to assume that most employees, or not most, but in every organization there's always a sufficient core of employees who will view any challenge you throw out at them in terms of a reward system as another gaming opportunity, and will apply their collective intelligence to undermining it as quickly as they can. So this is, it's a circular process in a sense in terms of trying to perfect this. So you have to follow, I think, two principles here that I've tried to do. One, when you set your goals and systems and so on, I do this somewhat shamelessly, leave yourself some discretion. If you're the CEO anyway, your HR head may or may not have that. But as the CEO, I absolutely leave myself some discretion, precisely because I anticipate that there will be a certain amount of gaming that comes. Discretion is not a bad thing. I know there are some cultures which will cry blue murder at the thought that there is a discretionary element and it should somehow be objectively determined, independently determined. All kinds of powerful words are used to undermine the notion of discretion. But discretion is the highest form of human intervention when properly utilized. So it must be utilized. And if you don't have the trust to utilize it, well, then you probably shouldn't be CEO. And if you do have the trust and you don't use it, then you're frankly not doing your job. So discretion, I think, is very, very important. The other element that you can use to mitigate this is, of course, systematically using a level of peer calibration right across your processes. Because beyond the discretion that you have, or in addition to the discretion that you have, if you start to create sufficient mechanisms where your outcomes are visible to me and mine are visible to you, and we get an opportunity to observe and comment on each other's outcomes, and some organizations systematically do that. Again, the professional services organization I worked at, that was a very important part of the evaluation, if you like, because beyond what we were formally asked to do was a whole process which assessed how our peers thought we had done or not done what we had been asked to do. So there was a set of objective metrics that came out that took normally 5 minutes of the discussion with my evaluator. But then there was a 45-minute discussion around how everybody else thought I had done it and how I had done it. Had I done it in the right way? Did I do it with the right set of values backing me? Did I do it without essentially pushing people out of the way, collaboratively, and so on? So you can introduce levels of peer calibration as you get to outcomes. I think between discretion and peer calibration, a reasonable amount of the gaming can be dampened, and next year you learn something and you reset the whole process again. But it's a very tough, I don't envy HR managers having to do this with their CEOs, but keep at it, because you get better at it the more consciously you do it.
Thank you, sir. Why don't we now call upon the person who asked that very interesting question, and the winner of the prize as well. He's the GM Corporate HR, Deepak Fertilizers. Please put your hands together for Mr. Ashutosh Sharma.
Oh, you have a Kindle Paperwhite. Very nice prizes they have, I must say. That's nice. Yeah. Well done. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you very much. How about a big round of applause for Mr. Puri once again? Thank you, sir, for sharing your views with us. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, as I said earlier, we have a packed agenda, and it is time to move on to our next keynote on inspiring win-win happier workplaces through a